Good morning in the US and good evening in Nepal or in the other places if you are in elsewhere, like so there might be night. Okay, so today we have a great speaker, Dr. Justin Gambrell. Dr. Justin Gambrell is an assistant professor in computation, mathematics, and science and engineering, and he's a member of Computational Education Research Lab at Michigan State University. Justin earned his bachelor's degree in physics from Michigan State University, along with a minor in mathematics in 2018. In 2024, he earned his PhD in physics from Drexel University, specializing in physics education research. His research has focused on assessment development of computational thinking in introductory physics. Dr. Gambrell's current research interests are in expanding assessment development in terms of exploring student effect and examining differences in computational thinking based on the computational environment used. In his free time, he enjoys playing video games, catching up on a massive watch list, and propagating houseplants. So, today, Dr. Gambrell is presenting on computational thinking assessment for introductory physics, design, implementation, and future direction. Also, I would like to, before before I hand over the screen to Dr. Gambrell, I would like to inform the audience that our next program is on November 16th at 10:30 a.m. US Eastern Time via WebEx by Justin Skane, educational specialist from National Science Foundation's Noir Lab. This program will be in astronomy. I would like to thank Dr. Sagar Podel for inviting the speaker. That is on November 16th, exactly at the same time. And our final program for this calendar year will be in December, along with ANPA Winter Week. And that is Faculty Jobs Application Do's and Don'ts on December 21st from 10 to 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time by Professor Doc Petke, who is the department head of physics at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. And I would like to thank Dr. Eric Bluey for connecting today's speaker. Really thankful. So thank you so much, Dr. Gambrell. So without any further ado, you can start your presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. That was very nice. And thank you for having me. Appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, so I will get right into it. This whole talk is centered on a multiple choice computational thinking assessment that I worked towards in my dissertation. So, as a little bit of background and setup, why is computation so important in physics and physics education? Well, computation is often seen as one of the three pillars of scientific inquiry in physics alongside theory and experimentation. The next generation science standards has placed computational thinking as a key practice of science and engineering since 2013. So there's been that placement of importance. Learning physics and computational thinking skills, they synergize well together. Physics provides a context to learn these computational thinking skills, and then computational thinking provides, or computational thinking skills provides sort of creativity and many avenues to explore within physics that don't restrain it. And along those lines, computation provides an authentic experience to physics education. Excuse me. So what is computational thinking? Computational thinking are the processes and practices necessary in the setup, execution, and analysis of phenomena computationally. And in other words, it's basically just thinking like a computer. What are the steps that you need to take? How can you optimize these steps? Stuff like that. And there are many facets and definitions for computational thinking, which typically depend on what context you are looking at. But in general, computational thinking across definitions share four common concepts. And those are the concept of decomposition, breaking things down into smaller, more manageable chunks; abstraction, finding the salient features of something that's complex; pattern recognition; and algorithms, creating algorithms. So, what does computational thinking look like in physics? Well, it's still being defined. In 2022, Weller et al. They made a framework of computational thinking practices in introductory physics. This is at the high school level. But other than that, computational thinking in physics is not as well defined. However, we personally, our research group, we define that computational thinking in physics are taught through the act of programming. Computational thinking, like I said before, these four elements of computational thinking, they're not necessarily tied to programming, but in physics we're saying that it is explicitly tied to programming when we learn them. Some more details about computational thinking in physics. There are a lot of computationally integrated physics courses in the US, but there is not as much formal adoption in this matter. Either there's no support from the department, or the instructors will implement or integrate computation on their own. With computational thinking and introductory physics still being defined, and a widespread availability of computational environments being relatively new, a modernization of curricula is needed. And this modernization can include, it's not limited to these, but it can include curricular reform, research involving the active learning strategies with computation, and developing assessments to assess if students are meeting the learning goals we want. And assessment is what I decided to focus on in terms of furthering the research of computational thinking in physics. Assessments are a driving force of physics education research. There is a sort of cyclical process where you reform a curriculum and then you assess this new curriculum, and you can use that assessment to then reform your curricula again. So there's this loop of assessment and curricular reform that we constantly need to be doing as educators. This type of assessment is valuable because there's no widespread validated assessment of computational thinking in physics as of yet. This assessment is going to help instructors assess their integration of computation in their courses. Again, because there's no formal adoption, they're typically doing these, integrating it on their own. So this is sort of a way to help them. And again, ultimately, it's for evaluating curricula, so that way we can better serve student learning and experiences in physics. So that then takes us to our research questions. We have three research questions. The first one is, what are the perceived benefits, challenges, and useful contexts for a computationally integrated introductory physics class, and what do these suggest for an assessment of computation and computational thinking? That first question is what I'm going to talk about in our first study, and I will get to the other two research questions later on in this presentation. So, in order to identify these benefits, challenges, and useful contexts, we decided to interview 26 physicists in 26 physicists about computation in introductory physics. These physicists had some relation to introductory physics and computation, either within academia or within industry, and they had beyond at least a bachelor's degree. So, interviewed 26 physicists. 8 of these physicists were from industry, and the other 18 were from academia. These interviews were semi-structured, hour-long interviews conducted within Zoom. And when in these interviews asked them about computational thinking, we did not provide a definition of computational thinking or practices before the interview because we didn't want to bias their responses and sort of see what their raw definition of computational thinking was. And these interviews were transcribed and analyzed in the software program of NVivo 12 Plus. Some of the questions from the interview to get us oriented were, what are some things that you expect a student should be able to do after taking an introductory computational integrated mechanics class? Another question, which coding languages would you expect to see in an intro mechanics class, if any, and why? And what are some limitations of a class like this? In total, I think we had 26 interview questions as well. When conducting these interviews, we used grounded theory and the constant comparative method to analyze and code these interviews. With the constant comparative method, the research begins with the raw data, the raw interview data, and then through comparisons, a theory can emerge. And as an example of this, initially we would ask about a programming environment known as Scratch, but after a few interviews, we realized that this question was not useful, as most of the instructors did not see it as sophisticated enough for the introductory physics level. So now I'm going to set up and talk about the results, and I have a little diagram to show this. So out of all the interview questions, we had 5 categories that sort of encompassed everything that we saw from these interviews. The first category was important computational topics. This category had responses from our participants that either they said was important themselves, or we identified it as important based on how they were talking about it. And within this category, we had subcategories of technical programming skills and knowledge, programming environment best practices, the intersection of physics and programming, strategies to make barrier reduction strategies, which is essentially just what are the things that make it easier for students to learn programming and physics together, and then constraints, essentially what not to do. Second category we had was the class programming environment. The third category was the limitations or difficulties. Fourth category was reasons for computation in introductory physics. And the fifth category was we had asked them how would they assess if students had met the learning goals. So Excuse me. So in our category of important computational topics, some codes that these are some codes that came up from the interviews. The text identifies what the code is, and then the number and percentage represent what percentage of the participants mentioned this this code. So, reading code had 77% of the respondents or participants mentioned that reading code was important for the students to be able to learn. Um, another uh, another thing that was brought up often was scaffolding code. 44% of them brought that up. Commenting code and data visualization was also pretty important as well. And there are other codes that were important but not as mentioned as frequently. In class programming environment, there was only one sub-theme as the barrier reducing environment. Essentially, most of the interviews or participants mentioned that the programming environment should be as easy to pick up as possible. It shouldn't be too complex. Um, yeah. And so along those lines, Python and VPython were mentioned a lot, and spreadsheets were also mentioned, which I found a bit interesting because spreadsheets, like Excel and Google Sheets, um, you might not think of these as a programming environment. Um, a lot of them also did mention that the language did not matter. That learning some language, as long as it is a programming language, it does not matter. Um, as long as because in any language they learn, they're going to be learning these coding skills. Some of the limitations or difficulties that they mentioned along the curriculum, changing sort of the instructor side of things, they mentioned that there wasn't any room for computation. How can they add computational practices or activities to an already full curriculum? Um, Something else, they mention this as a limitation or difficulty, but something else, most of these participants, after mentioning that, would then say that removing stuff from the curriculum um, and replacing it with computational activities sort of is better in general. It's there you're gaining back what you're losing. So they would mention it as a limitation or difficulty, but then sort of refute that statement after. The other one that they mentioned was just the idea of curricular overhaul, having to go through your entire curriculum and change things to be um, computational. That one they did not have as much of a response for. And I think this makes sense because, again, there's not much financial support in terms of an instructor overhauling a curriculum to include computational practices. On the student side, for limitations and difficulties, they mentioned students rejecting the idea of computation being a part of physics, and students coming in with different levels of experience. Under reasons for computation in introductory physics, um, they just mentioned stuff like it makes modeling physics easier, and you can allow non-trivial phenomena for them to explore, and they can understand physics better. And the most cited or most common response was, it is a career skill. It's going to be good for their future careers. And this last category / question, which is important for the rest of this talk, was we asked them, how would they assess if students had met these learning goals? 54% of them said they would do something like a comprehension assessment. So reading code, commenting code, finding the physics in code, reading code, and then predicting and explaining what the output would be. And then there were other participants that mentioned like an attitudinal assessment. How are the students feeling about their understanding of and use of computation, and can they write and run a program? So in terms of answering this first research question, the benefits were developing skills of a 21st century scientist and preparing these students for either their future careers or classes, and in general, enhancing their physics learning experience. The challenges were student attitudes towards computation, curricular overhaul. And what were some of the useful contexts? Well, we saw that it should be inside of a programming environment, that Python and VPython were mentioned the most, and so this should be the environment, or it should be, I guess, a recommended environment they work in, along with spreadsheets. And yeah, and that the programming environment doesn't matter as much as long as they're still learning these skills. And what does this suggest for an assessment? Well, the most agreed upon learning goal was that students should be able to read physical programs and extract the relevant information from them. So based on these results, that then takes us to our next two research questions. Can we create an assessment, or how can we create an assessment that is representative of a student's knowledge after taking a computationally integrated physics class? And what are the features that are particularly well suited to assessments in these physics classes? So to tackle these research questions, we started developing an assessment. Along those lines, assessments need to be valid and reliable. Validity is the accuracy and quality of factual soundness of the assessment. Are we assessing what we think we're assessing? And reliability is the consistency and reproducibility of this assessment. If we were to give it to the same student over and over again, how would they fare? Or if we gave it to a similar student group, how would they fare? We addressed the validity and reliability of the assessment with classical test theory. Classical test theory essentially uses psychometric properties, looking at item difficulty or test taker ability. And within classical test theory, the sort of two main things that we focused on were item difficulty and item discrimination, which I will talk about later. So to get a little bit more in the mind space where we're at, we want an assessment that could be widely distributed to as many instructors, using or integrating computation into their introductory physics courses as possible. And because reading program code and predicting and explaining results from a code and commenting code were the most frequently mentioned responses in terms of how to assess, we decided to make a multiple choice assessment and to directly incorporate those dimensions of computational thinking into this assessment. So a little bit of information about the assessment as a whole. It's a multiple choice and multiple response uh, question format. It We piloted this assessment and it was administered as a pre and post. There were 15 questions on the pre and 21 questions on the post. The reason why there's a difference in the number of questions is because students that were first coming into the class, they may have never seen um, code or programming before, and so we wanted to sort of not overload them with an assessment right off the bat. So we tried to remove the questions that we saw were a little bit more in depth. These questions were modified and inspired from the Phys 113 course at Drexel, and this multiple choice test was administered online using Qualtrics and was written in the VPython language. We piloted this assessment in the fall of 2023 at 4 different institutions. Each of the instructors taught an introductory physics course using computational methods in the language of VPython. And this little table shows a little bit of information about the institutions. Something to notice about our data is that that third institution is sort of dominating all the other institutions. So we present our results in aggregate for all 4 of these institutions, but just keep in mind that most of this data is coming from the third one, and so it's tough to sort of expand and say that it's our results are not specific to essentially that one course. So to measure our content validity, which is essentially determining if we are meeting all the concepts of computational thinking in physics, introductory physics, we selected 7 of our 21 questions that we saw as representational of all the different types of questions on our assessment, and we gave it to the 4 instructors who were teaching these courses, and then we asked them to identify which computational thinking practices described in Weller et al.'s framework these specific questions address. So in the top of this table, we've got our computational practices, CTP 1 through 14. And on the left-hand side, we have our questions, our 7 questions. These practices map to these practices on this previous slide. So CTP 1 is decomposing, 2 is highlighting and foregrounding, translating physics into code, algorithm building, applying conditional logic. And what we saw after they marked which practices they thought each question had, we saw that a majority of our questions involved practices like translating physics to code, which is CTP3, decomposing, highlighting, and foregrounding, essentially the first 5. And we also had a few of the questions that focused on debugging, which is that CTP 12 here. We can also see that there's quite a few of these practices that we're not hitting very well, like CTP 14 we're not really hitting, 13, and 8, 9, and 10. And we can see 10, 13, and 14. 10 is manipulating data. So because these are multiple choice questions and they're not actively writing code, it sort of makes sense that they're not manipulating data. Working in groups on computational models they took this individually, so that makes sense. Demonstrating affective dispositions towards computation. This is sort of looking at how they feel about computational thinking. We didn't ask any affective questions, so it makes sense that that was not identified. If we now look at how the students performed on the pre and post, we had 500 matched responses for pre and post. The pre-average was 6.92, while the post average was 7.57. And so there is a statistical difference between the pre and post using a paired sample t-test. However, it's a small effect size. So they're doing better, but not by much. This is their average total score. The maximum that they could have gotten was 14. So we're also seeing that they're only getting around half of all the questions right. In this plot, we focus on the questions individually and how they performed pre to post. In most of these questions, they either performed just as well or a little bit better on the post than they did the pre. There is one question where they performed better on the question in the pre than they did in the post, which is quite interesting. We also look at how long it took on average to complete these assessments. The pre-assessment median time was 7 minutes, while the post was 11 minutes. And then we also looked at what their average score was based on how long they took taking the assessment. And yeah. For concurrent validity, we looked at how many prior programming environments the student had worked with, or a group of students had worked with, compared to their average total score. The first question we had on our assessment was, which of these programming environments have you worked with before or had experience with before? They could select between 9 options, and then there was a 10th option where they can write in any other programming environments that they had worked with. So we sort of see that the more programming environments that they had worked with, the higher average total score they had gotten. This is definitely interesting in my eyes because it makes me wonder if the assessment is too computational focused. If students with more programming environments are performing higher, how are students with I guess better physics knowledge comparing with the total score? In terms of partial sample reliability, we didn't see a difference in scores of the matched versus unmatched students on the pre-assessment, but there was a difference in the matched versus unmatched students' average total score for the post. And this just means that there's an indication of selection bias. And so the students who took both the pre and the post are performing better than the students who only took the post. So this plot is where I'm going to talk about item discrimination and item difficulty. We've got discrimination on the y-axis, item difficulty on the x-axis. Item difficulty refers to how difficult a question was. The higher a score in terms of item difficulty means that the question was easily answered. The lower score on item difficulty means it was more difficult. In terms of item discrimination is it's how a question discriminates. It is taking a group of the highest scoring participants on like the top 20% of the highest scoring participants overall on the assessment, and the lowest 20% of the students for the overall assessment, and compares how these two groups did on a particular item. So if an item discriminates well, it has a higher positive item discrimination. It means that the students who did well overall on the assessment also did well on this particular question. If an item does not discriminate well, it is more negative or close to zero, and it means that the students who did not as well overall on the assessment did well on the particular item. So it essentially indicates that there's something going on with this question that doesn't match up with the rest of the questions. If you have a question that is discriminating poorly, we're wondering why are the students that did not do as well overall doing well on this particular item. So in terms of item discrimination and difficulty, I guess along those lines, in terms of validity, we're looking for an item difficulty between 0.2 and 0.8. And for item discrimination, we're looking for ones that discriminate really well are going to be above 0.3, and ones that discriminate, sort of okay are above 0.1. So we have our sort of green section indicating that these are questions that were an appropriate difficulty and discriminated well. We have 8 questions in this sort of good region. Over here, this has multiple choice question 1 through 5. These discriminated well, however, they were too easy, which is not good, because if a question is too easy, we're essentially not getting any useful information on it. If everyone, can see the question and answer it correctly, it's not really useful. But these first 5 questions, we did intentionally design them to be easier to get the students sort of into the mindset of what they're going to be doing or thinking about for this assessment. And then we also see we have some questions that were too hard and also just did not discriminate well. MCQ 15 and MCQ 10 in particular were very poor, which we will need to change. This table, I don't think I'm going to spend too much time on, but essentially that first question where we asked about their experience with programming environments that they've had, we looked at what their average score was if they indicated they had experience with a particular programming environment or not. So we can see the 9 that we brought up were Python, VPython, GlowScript, JavaScript, MATLAB, Mathematica, Excel, Google Sheets, and Google Colab. And we can see, for example, the students with Python experience versus the students without Python experience had a higher average score. And it was statistically significant with a large, or at least medium effect size. So I'm not going to go through all these, but this information is there. The sort of interesting thing here is all these classes used VPython, and we did not see a significant difference in the total average score for VPython, the students with VPython experience versus the students without VPython experience on both the pre and post. So those were just some validity and reliability measures we took for assessment, and what are some of the takeaways. And excuse me. So with our content validity, we saw that our assessment addressed some computational thinking practices really well in terms of Weller's framework. And the ones that that were addressed quite well were translating physics to code, decomposing, and conditional logic. Some of the deficiencies, though, were generating data, manipulating data, and student attitudes. And this is, it's a product of the way we designed our assessment. It's a multiple choice assessment, so it makes sense that they weren't generating data. But in order to fully capture students' computational thinking, we will need to address these in some way by either designing a multiple choice that has them generating data somehow, or incorporating an aspect where they are actively coding, along with student attitudes. There was a median time of 7 on the pre and 11 minutes on the post, which is an indication that our assessment is too short. Most assessments or conceptual surveys that are multiple choice take anywhere between, on average, between 30 minutes and 45 minutes. So we have room for growth there. 8 of the 20 questions from our discrimination versus difficulty plot, 8 of the 20 questions had acceptable difficulty in discrimination, and the rest of them are going to need, in the very least, modification or removal. So again, our research questions were looking at the benefits, challenges, and context for computationally integrated introductory physics class. And we addressed that through our interview study. And then when we examined how we could create an assessment that is representative of the student's knowledge, we tried to do that using a multiple choice assessment. And the features of computational thinking that were particularly well suited were translating physics to code. In summary, integrating computational thinking into introductory physics is important for student learning in general, and it is also important for their future careers and classes, but it does require time on the instructor side to overhaul or change the curriculum. The environment should be easy for students to learn, and right now Python and VPython are the most recommended. And our multiple choice assessment can target certain aspects of computational thinking, but not all of them. So what's next? Well, we're now thinking about, because we have essentially room for growth in this assessment, thinking of things that we can add to our assessment. The first thing is we could look at student demographic data and or institutional/course variance to see how the context relates to assessment performance. We didn't collect any demographic data. We also didn't collect the course's curriculum. And so examining the curriculum to see how it maps to the assessment might be interesting. We also did not compare our assessment scores to a control group. We didn't give our assessment to an introductory physics course that did not have computation included. So it'd be interesting to see how these two scores compare, because ultimately we have this intersection of computation and physics. But how would these students that just have this physics part do? Because we have room, we can add attitudinal questions or potentially pair it with an attitudinal assessment so that we can more fully capture computational thinking in students. We also can collect data on their score on a physics conceptual survey, like the Force Concept Inventory, for example, and compare their score on the FCI to our computational thinking assessment to see how sort of their computational thinking score compares to their purely physics knowledge score. And sort of lastly, as the final takeaway, this assessment still needs to be refined before we are able to broadly disseminate it. But we have a clear research path forward and know which questions are working well right now and which ones aren't and need to be changed. Yeah, that's it. This is a picture of my two research groups. And yes, thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gambrell, for excellent presentation. So if there are any questions, please unmute and ask the speaker or put in the chat box. Before we get any question, I would like to start. So this is your PhD research, right? So it is an excellent research, and thank you so much for a great presentation. Currently, you are a professor. Probably you are implementing computational thinking in your classrooms. So when computational comes, I have been teaching since last several years at WPI, Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts. So I see once in a while, like I see kind of resistance from students. Why do we need to? We are learning physics. Why do we need to do this kind of things like computational, like integrating, like for example, in our introductory physics labs, uh, in error analysis, we have implemented Python course and like that. Some of the students show kind of resistance on that. Like, do you have that kind of experience in your class from your classroom, Dr. Gambrell?
So right now, I'm not teaching a physics course. I'm teaching essentially an introductory to Python in various STEM contexts. But when I tried to implement a computational activity into one of our introductory physics courses at Drexel, I did experience sort of that same sentiment of why do we have to do this? This isn't physics. This is coding. Why do I have to learn programming when physics is not programming? So I definitely experienced that, and along with the interviews, there were quite a few instructors that uh, sort of have been struggling with students resisting the integration of computation in physics. Um, that being said, uh, the best thing we can do is, well, not necessarily the best thing, but we might try and remind students why it's being added in the first place. One is that it adds creativity. They can explore things more thoroughly. Um, and it helps them learn physics better. Um, and so, yeah, just trying to remind them of these things. It's definitely tough because physics is already seen as a difficult subject, and programming and coding is seen as a difficult and hard thing to do. And so combining those two can be really stressful and sort of discouraging to students.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there any questions? Please unmute and ask, or if you put the question in the chat box, I can read the question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ramesh Lunyana from Colorado. So I don't know
Hi.
if you can hear me or not. But
Yes.
okay. So yeah, definitely interesting. And what I found more interesting is like, you were able to, design some sort of assessment and some questions to actually evaluate the learning in computational thinking. So I'm interested in two things. One, like yes, you gave the idea, like what was the main, like let's say theme of the questions were in those different categories, right? Are there like exact questions that you are, like you found that in the blue group, that was kind of validated in terms of both let's say uh, discrimination and the let's say, yeah, I think you try to validate, right? So those questions, right? So I'm interested in looking at, what exactly those questions look like, if they are available somewhere, right? That I can open in the link and look. Another one is like, if I'm interested in integrating this computational thinking in my introductory class, right? So how do I modify my curriculum? Of course, like we can come up with some idea, but since looks like you have looked at the people who has already been doing that, like, so how do they actually modify curriculum other than programming language they use, right? So I saw they use Python, Python mostly, but like exactly in syllabus, in curriculum, in topics, how do they integrate those languages and codes, and how do they execute in the class? That's what I'm interested in learning, so that if that sounds interesting, feasible, maybe I could use that in my classroom.
Yeah. Um, Let me address your second question first. Um, that one is a little bit tough because there's not there's not a great structure as to how to implement or integrate computation into the your physics curriculum. The one and when I interviewed people and just in general discussions, people are implementing it in different ways. Some people felt very strongly that they should be using Excel or Google Sheets, some type of spreadsheet to show the like each update of like a projectile motion, but they don't feel the need that they need to be coding. Um, so there's lots of various ways. There's also even a P cubed at Michigan State. They have in this course they have students work on their computational activities in a group, and so there's lots of different ways in which people have been integrating it, but because there's not the structure just isn't there, the foundation isn't there, we don't there's not necessarily a widespread um, curriculum that's being used. That's why I think this assessment is valuable and useful, so that way we can sort of identify what the what's working well in terms of the instructors that are implementing it, and what can be improved. Along those lines, the one thing that these instructors mentioned in their interviews when doing this curricular overhaul, the one thing they mentioned though is if you're going to do it, make sure you do it for the entire course. Don't just do one activity. Make sure it's integrated throughout the course. Otherwise, they'll just see it as a one-off thing and probably not learn from it. That was the one thing that I remember from these interviews that they harped on. And yeah, and if you're really interested in how you might implement or integrate computation, I would recommend, as a starting point, talking to someone who is doing it and see if you can get their materials and then modify it from there. As for your first question as to if these questions are available and where you can get them, they are in a Qualtrics form right now. I can make them available and provide the link. I don't have it ready to give to you right now, but I can, like, if you all provide me, I can send it to someone so that you have it. I just don't have it immediately. Like, I can get it to you by the end of today.
Okay, thank you.
I think you have email address of Dr. Rudra Kahle.
Yes.
Right. So you can send it to him and he will distribute, I think.
Yes. If that's all right.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. That's a great question. And we are about 1 hour mark. Like, so do we have any last minute question to the speaker? So it looks like that all the questions are answered. Like, so let's thank Dr. Gambrell and yeah, we also stop recording, and probably if there are more questions, then we will do informal discussions.